I wonder why we're gathering at Casco Bay Lines, and there's several answers to that. The major one is because there was a rescue of a fugitive off of a boat that was out in the wharf there. The boat was called Her Majesty, being Victoria. Her Majesty's ship, the Albion Cooper. And evidently the captain, they had been to South Carolina to pick up a load of lumber, and they brought it here. Now, why they were bringing lumber to Maine, I don't have the answer for. But the record was made of this. The story was written down by, and you'll hear Fessenden. Samuel Fessenden, his son Samuel, wrote the history of this, and Samuel Jr. Had worked out a system with the white and the African-American abolitionists that, given the knowledge that a fugitive was somewhere nearby, they would cooperate together, and in a dramatic instance of cooperation between the white and the black abolitionists. Yes, I'd like that hat.
You want to wear it?
I do. Samuel Fessenden Jr. went around and got money from all of the probably white abolitionists, but maybe some of the black too, because if they were arrested doing this, of course it was a federal crime, and they would have court costs. So by the stealth of night, the two groups, the white abolitionists and the black ones, came down and went out onto the wharf, and the white abolitionists surrounded the black abolitionists, which allowed the black ones to get down into a little boat and row out to the ship. And the captain and the crew, because they were largely British, and England had outlawed slavery and the slave trade a long time, in the 1830s. Thank you. Because they weren't facing prosecution, but who knows, they might have been prosecuted by the federal government. They had made the agreement that they would look the other way, so if they ended up in court, they could honestly say, we didn't see a thing. The black, and they had the fugitive down in a little corner of the boat, and the black abolitionists, without letting the fugitive, who was probably freaked out, know that that's what they were going to do with him, grabbed him, took him into the little boat, and rowed back to shore. Now, all we know from there on out, and remember this is all very much at nighttime, the white abolitionists surrounded the black abolitionists, and they took him, and we're going to go the route. So all we know is that this guy went to the head of Hancock Street, and I'm going to take you to the head of Hancock Street, and he just vanishes from history.
Wow.
As well. I mean, we know that he was taken on to safety in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah.
So was he a fugitive from slavery? Or?
Yeah, he was a
okay.
slave.
What's his name again?
We don't have his name.
Wow.
But we do have the name. And she had escaped from Maryland the same way Frederick Douglass had escaped from Maryland, dressed as a sailor.
As a guy?
Dressed as a guy. She cross-dressed, he didn't.
Oh.
But because African Americans were such a prevalence in the maritime forces prior to 1865, people didn't notice. They just assumed, they were working on the waterfronts somewhere. And he took her from New York City to Montreal on the Grand Trunk Railroad. This was the Grand Trunk building in Portland. Although my guess is this was built after the Great Fire, which I haven't talked about enough yet.
Sorry, would you say?
Probably built after 1866, after the Great Fire.
This one here?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This was
the fire.
The fire
Usually
was
they have a date.
1866.
Oh, it was.
Yeah. And
So these were their administrative offices.
yeah. Oh, I know what. Most recently, there were a lot of questions about the use of water. There is a spring underneath the Abyssinian, which we'll get to. Mm-hmm. And the belief had been that somehow the members of the church sold the water, like they do at Our Lady of Lourdes Shrine.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And but they couldn't find any record of that. Was an oral tradition, which may not be true. And again, it may be true. But one thing they did do was they did sell water to the Grand Trunk Railroad. It took a lot of water So they had a really large contract to supply water from that underneath the Abyssinian. The African American men who were leaders of their communities were all either mariners, hack drivers, the equivalent of taxis today, secondhand clothing dealers, and we only have one monument at a secondhand clothing site. And there were four professions that they mostly were. The mariners were the best paid of the four. Barbers or hairdressers, which eventually also became wig makers. The mariners were the best paid. They became the cornerstones of the black community. Up near the Abyssinian, we have a monument to Charles Frederick Eastman, and he was all of those things. Almost all of the men were one of those things, but if they became a mariner, they held on to that job because that was the best paid.
Yes, I was wondering who developed the beautiful symbol of the Freedom Trail that's on the top of those signs.
His name is Daniel Minter, and he is an artist par excellence. His paintings are beautiful. His house is a piece of artwork itself. It's on Deering, quite close to the synagogue.
Oh, and besides that, you were booking.
You know, I tried to write this history appreciating women's contributions because they get forgotten, and if they're black women, they just get totally forgotten. But I found a website that had a copy of the tintype of Christiana Taylor Williams Freeman. In 1863, they were in New York City. They were here from 1841 to 1852, and then they went back to the same Shiloh Presbyterian Church where he had come from and where he spent the rest of his life. She was the director of the Colored Orphans Asylum. There was a huge riot in New York City. In fact, it's considered one of the three pivotal moments in New York's history. So in 1826, a group of 5 African American men published a letter to the newspaper. It was the Democratic Party newspaper called the Eastern Argus. And this appeared on September 15th, 1826. And in this, they talk about the oppression that they feel in the white churches. And even First Parish will show you where the blacks had to sit. It was in the upstairs, the balcony. And that was repeated. It was the same thing was true in the Methodist Church, probably the Congregational Church. And this is full of 19th century flowery language, but I like it because it tells us how many African Americans there were in Portland in 1826. Our numbers amount to about 600.
Wow.
Provision for the accommodation of a very few of our people is made in several houses of public worship. But while the provision is totally inadequate to our wants, the privilege granted us is associated with such circumstances as are calculated to repel rather than to invite our attendance. Nay, pardon our misapprehension, if it be such. We have sometimes thought that our attendance was not desired. This is on microfiche down at the library.
That's incredible.
The undersigned are persuaded that nothing could so much contribute to improve the character and the tone of moral feeling amongst their people as the erection for the use of a suitable house of public worship and the regular ministrations of the gospel. So, it is signed by Reuben Ruby and Christopher Christian Manuel and 3 others. But Reuben Ruby is the one that comes back because he's the one who bought the ground that this is on. He bought it for $250 from a man who was a member of First Parish. So there's always this connection between First Parish.